Good day. I'm Dr. Joel C. Egco, author of The Death of Utopia, Karl Popper, and the Fall of Maoist Ideology in the Philippines. At heart of this book are 10 core insights that challenge some of the most influential political ideas of the last century. The first is Karl Popper's revolutionary idea of intellectual humility. While ideologues claimed certainty, Popper asked a simple question: what if we are wrong? The second insight is the moral foundation of the book. No utopia is worth a single Filipino life. Human life is not the price of history. Human life is the purpose of history. Third, the book argues that the revolutionary doctrine presented as uniquely Filipino may have been built on foundations borrowed from earlier Maoist and Indonesian communist frameworks. Fourth, I describe this as chop suey Caesarism, a mixture of Marx, Lenin, Mao, aided, and local grievances assembled into a doctrine presented as scientific certainty. Fifth, the book challenges the long-standing semi-feudal, semi-colonial thesis, arguing that ideology eventually stopped explaining reality and began replacing it. Sixth, Popper dismantles the idea of historical inevitability. History has no script. No party owns the future. No movement can scientifically predict humanity's destination. Seventh, unlike science, which survives by testing and correcting error, revolutionary dogmas often survive through reinterpretation. Every failure becomes proof. Every setback becomes validation. Eighth, democracy's greatest achievement is not choosing perfect leaders. It is allowing societies to correct mistakes peacefully. Ballots are superior to bullets. Reform is superior to revolution. Ninth, error can be corrected. This insight is deeply personal. Human beings are not defined by their mistakes, but by their capacity to recognize and correct them. And finally, the 10th insight. The death of utopia is the birth of humanity. When certainty dies, humility emerges. When fanaticism dies, freedom emerges. When utopia dies, dialogue, compassion, tolerance, and human dignity take its place. That is the central argument of this book. No ideology, no revolution, no promised paradise is worth a single Filipino life. Because human life is not the price of history. Human life is the purpose of history. Thank you and welcome to The Death of Utopia. First glance, many people assume this is a book about communism. Others assume it is a book about the cpp-npa-ndf. But the truth is, this book is about something much larger. It is about one of humanity's oldest and most dangerous mistakes. The belief that some people possess the final truth about history, society, and the future, and therefore have the right to sacrifice human lives in pursuit of a perfect world. For more than a century, revolutionary movements around the world have promised paradise, a perfect society, a classless society, a liberated society. But history repeatedly teaches us the same painful lesson. Every utopia promises paradise. Eventually, every utopia demands victims. This book is built around the ideas of one of the 20th century's greatest philosophers, Karl Popper. While dictators, revolutionaries, and ideologues claimed certainty, Popper asked a simple but revolutionary question: what if we are wrong? That question changed philosophy, it changed science, and in many ways, it changed my life. Popper taught that no individual, no party, no government, and no ideology possesses final truth. Truth is not something we own. Truth is something we pursue. And we get closer to it, not through obedience, but through criticism, questioning, and the courage to admit our mistakes. That insight became the lens through which I examined the Maoist insurgency in the Philippines through history, philosophy, documentary evidence, and my own experience as a former recruit of the underground movement. I explore how certainty becomes dogma, how dogma becomes obedience, and how obedience eventually demands sacrifice. But this is not merely a critique of an ideology. It is a defense of freedom, a defense of democracy, a defense of critical thinking, and above all, a defense of human life. Because at the heart of this book lies a simple moral conclusion: no revolution, no ideology, no prophecy, no promised paradise is worth a single Filipino life. Human life is not the price of history. Human life is the purpose of history. The death of Utopia is ultimately a journey from certainty to humility, from indoctrination to freedom, and from fanaticism back to our common humanity. I invite you to read the book, challenge its arguments, examine the evidence, and join the conversation. One of the most provocative chapters in this book is Chapter 4, The Great Maoist Cosplay, How the cpp-npa-ndf imported a foreign revolution and tried to make it Pinoy. For more than 5 decades, generations of Filipinos have been taught that Jose Maria Sison was an original revolutionary thinker who crafted a uniquely Filipino revolutionary doctrine embodied in Filipino society and revolution. Chapter 4 challenges that narrative. The evidence I examined points in a different direction. Historical records, comparative textual analysis, documented revolutionary literature, organizational parallels, political sequencing, and even emerging scientific methods of textual comparison all point toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. The intellectual architecture of Sison's revolutionary framework bears striking similarities to earlier works and doctrines associated with Indonesian Communist leader Dipa Nusantara Aidit and the Indonesian Communist Party or PKI. The similarities are not confined to isolated concepts. They appear in the diagnosis of society, the revolutionary roadmap, the treatment of class struggle, the concept of national democratic revolution, the role of the vanguard, the stages of revolutionary development, and the claim that history itself guarantees revolutionary victory. Viewed collectively, these parallels become difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The evidence increasingly suggests that what was presented as an original Filipino revolutionary doctrine may have been substantially adapted from an earlier Indonesian and Maoist template. To put it bluntly, the historical trail points not toward originality, but toward imitation. Not toward invention, but adaptation. Not toward a uniquely Filipino revolutionary blueprint, but toward a foreign model repackaged for Philippine conditions. The slogans became Filipino, the geography became Filipino, the actors became Filipino, but much of the script appears to have been written elsewhere. This is why I describe the phenomenon as chop suey Sisonism, a mixture of Marx, Lenin, Mao, Aidit, and local grievances assembled into a doctrine presented as revolutionary certainty. In The Death of Utopia, I introduce this argument as part of a broader critique of ideological dogma and historical inevitability. But the evidence is so extensive that it deserves an entire book of its own. That is why I am currently completing a companion volume scheduled for release in August 2026. Joma, the Indonesian Copycat, Breaking the Myth, Unmaking the Legend. In that book, I examine the documentary record, the historical context, the textual parallels, and the evidence suggesting that Jose Maria Sison's project may owe far more to Dipa Nusantara Aidit than most Filipinos have ever been told. If that conclusion proves correct, the implications are profound, because generations of Filipinos may not merely have fought and died for a dream. They may have fought and died for someone else's dream. And that is a question history can no longer afford to ignore. One of the most important arguments in this book appears in chapter 4.23, which I call the better halves. For more than half a century, the Communist Party of the Philippines viewed the country through a framework it described as semi-colonial and semi-feudal. This diagnosis did not originate in the Philippines. As discussed extensively in the book, it mirrors the same revolutionary diagnosis advanced decades earlier by Indonesian Communist leader Dipa Nusantara Aidit in Indonesian society and Indonesian Revolution, before it later reappeared in Jose Maria Sison's Philippine Society and Revolution. But there is a problem. A diagnosis is only useful if it continues to describe reality. And reality changed. The Philippines changed. The world changed. Technology changed. Global trade changed. Entire industries emerged. The middle class expanded. Millions of Filipinos entered professions that neither Marx, Mao, Edith, nor Season ever anticipated. Yet the diagnosis remained frozen. This is what Karl Popper warned against: the danger of treating a theory as permanent, while reality continues to move. In this book, I argue that the so-called semi-colonial and semi-feudal framework no longer explains the Philippines of the 21st century. Its better halves have gradually overtaken it. Instead of semi-colonialism, we now see sovereign interdependence. The Philippines is connected to the world through trade, diplomacy, technology, migration, and investment. But connection is not the same as colonization. Nations today prosper not through isolation, but through strategic engagement while retaining sovereignty. And instead of semi-feudalism, we increasingly see economic plurality. The modern economy is no longer dominated by landlords and peasants alone. It includes entrepreneurs, professionals, overseas workers, cooperatives, digital creators, service industries, technology firms, small businesses, and countless other actors interacting in complex ways. Society cannot be reduced to a single-class struggle template written in the 1960s. The lesson is profound. History is not frozen. Societies evolve. Diagnoses must evolve with them. The tragedy of closed ideologies is that they keep answering today's questions with yesterday's assumptions. The better halves represent a rejection of that intellectual rigidity. They recognize complexity, they recognize change, and they recognize that reality is always larger than doctrine. Because when evidence changes, honest thinkers revise their theories. Only dogmas refuse to learn. And that may be the ultimate lesson of Chapter 4. The Philippines did not remain trapped in the world AD described, nor in the world Season inherited. History moved on, reality moved on, and any ideology that refuses to move with it eventually becomes a prisoner of its own past. One of the most disturbing chapters in this book is Chapter 5, because Chapter 5 is not about guns, it is not about ambushes, it is about something far more powerful: the systematic reprogramming of the human mind. For decades, many Filipinos believed that people joined the revolutionary movement because they were poor, angry, or oppressed. The reality is more complex. Many recruits were intelligent, idealistic, compassionate, patriotic, and that is precisely why they became vulnerable. Because the revolutionary movement does not begin by teaching violence, it begins by teaching meaning, purpose, belonging, identity. The rifle comes later. This chapter introduces a concept I call terror-grooming, the gradual process through which individuals are transformed from independent thinkers into instruments of an ideological cause. It is not a single event. It is a process, a system, a factory. What emerges is what I describe as a factory of obedience and death. Like every factory, it has an input and an output. The input is idealism. The output is obedience. The input is compassion. The output is conformity. The process begins with recruitment, then ideological formation, then organizational discipline, then identity replacement. The individual slowly ceases to ask, "Is this true?" and begins asking, "Is this acceptable to the movement?" Truth becomes secondary. Doctrine becomes primary. Conscience becomes subordinate to ideology. This transformation is reinforced through the doctrine of People's War. Its ultimate battlefield is the Filipino mind. Everything is viewed through a revolutionary lens. Family becomes secondary. Faith becomes secondary. Community becomes secondary to the struggle. The revolution becomes the center of meaning itself. This is why Chapter 5 also discusses one of the most tragic consequences of ideological certainty: spy tagging killings. Across decades of insurgency, civilians were accused of being spies, informers, or traitors. Farmers, teachers, community leaders, workers, ordinary Filipinos. Many died not because of what they did, but because of what they were accused of being. This is the terrible consequence of closed systems. When an ideology believes it possesses absolute truth, doubt becomes betrayal, criticism becomes treason, and human beings become expendable. Karl Popper warned us about this danger. The moment an organization becomes incapable of admitting error, it begins manufacturing enemies. And when enemies are manufactured, violence inevitably follows. The most dangerous weapon is the unquestioned idea. That is why the defense of freedom begins with critical thinking, the courage to question, the courage to challenge doctrine, and the courage to remain human in the face of ideological certainty. Because no cause, no revolution, and no promised utopia should ever demand the surrender of a person's mind before it demands the surrender of a person's life. One of the most revealing sections of Chapter 10 examines not merely what the Communist Party of the Philippines teaches, but what it ultimately demands from its members. Buried within the CPP Constitution and Program is a principle that every communist cadre is expected to embrace: the willingness to sacrifice one's life for the party and the revolution. At first glance, this may sound noble. History is filled with people willing to die for causes they believed in. Soldiers do it, firefighters do it, patriots do it. But Chapter 10 asks a more difficult question. What happens when an ideology requires sacrifice before it has proven itself true? This is where Karl Popper becomes relevant. Popper argued that no political theory is infallible. No movement possesses absolute truth. All human knowledge remains provisional, imperfect, and open to correction. Yet the CP Constitution demands a level of commitment usually reserved for unquestionable religious faith. Members are expected to subordinate personal interests, family, careers, and ultimately even life itself to the revolutionary cause. The individual becomes secondary. The party becomes supreme. And that creates a profound moral problem. Because if the theory is wrong, then the sacrifice becomes tragic. If the diagnosis is wrong, the deaths become unnecessary. If the promised future never arrives, entire generations may have suffered for an illusion. Chapter 10 therefore argues that the real issue is not courage. Many coders were undoubtedly courageous. The issue is whether courage was directed toward truth or toward dogma. Thousands of young Filipinos entered the underground believing they were participating in a scientifically inevitable revolution. Many died in encounters. Many lost decades in the mountains. Many abandoned families, education, careers, and opportunities. The tragedy is that these sacrifices were demanded not in the service of a proven reality, but in service of a revolutionary prophecy that repeatedly failed empirical testing. This is why the death of Utopia reaches a simple but powerful conclusion. No ideology is worth a human life if that ideology cannot be questioned. No political theory deserves blind obedience, and no party should ever place itself above the human beings it claims to liberate. Because in an open society, people exist before ideology. Human life comes before doctrine, and truth must always be allowed to challenge belief, even when belief demands sacrifice. Chapter 12 of The Death of Utopia begins with a simple but unsettling realization. The battlefield has moved. For decades, revolutionary recruitment happened in secret meetings, underground study circles, and remote villages. Today, it happens in your news feed, in your group chats, in your recommendations, in your algorithm. The mountains have been replaced by the smartphone, and the rifle has been preceded by the scroll. This chapter explores what I call the digitalization of terror-grooming. The CPP no longer needs to find recruits. The algorithm finds them. A student frustrated by corruption, a worker angry at injustice, a young person searching for meaning, a citizen disappointed with government. These emotions are real. These grievances are often legitimate. but they become dangerous when they are systematically manipulated. The process is remarkably predictable. First comes emotional hooking, then grievance amplification, then identity formation, then ideological isolation, and finally, recruitment. The recruiter does not begin with Marx. The recruiter does not begin with revolution. The recruiter begins with a far simpler question. Kamusta ka? The objective is not merely to persuade. The objective is to reshape how reality itself is interpreted. The feed becomes a classroom. The algorithm becomes a political officer. And outrage becomes a recruitment tool. What follows is what this book calls the arouse, organize, mobilize, or AOM process. Arouse anger, organize grievance, mobilize action. The same revolutionary blueprint that once operated in campuses and communities now operates through likes, shares, reposts, live streams, and viral content. The technology changed, the methodology did not. But Chapter 12 is not merely a warning, it is also a defense of freedom. Karl Popper taught that open societies survive because ideas are allowed to compete, because claims are challenged, because truth is tested. The antidote to propaganda is not censorship, it is critical thinking. The antidote to manipulation is not silence, it is scrutiny. The antidote to ideological grooming is the courage to ask questions. Because in the digital age, the most important battle is no longer for territory. It is for attention. It is for judgment. It is for the human mind itself. And in that battle, the greatest act of freedom remains the simplest: to think for yourself. For decades, the Communist Party of the Philippines has attempted to blur a crucial distinction. The distinction between activism and revolution, between dissent and insurgency, between the citizen and the combatant. Chapter 15 asks a simple but devastating question. When did carrying a placard become carrying a rifle? Imagine two young Filipinos. The first stands in a public square. She speaks against corruption. She questions government policies. She demands accountability. She organizes communities. She writes. She debates. She protests. She votes. She criticizes. And she does all this without firing a single shot. The second disappears into the mountains. He is told that elections are meaningless, that reforms are illusions, that democracy is a fraud, that the rifle is history's true ballot. One is an activist. The other is being transformed into a soldier. The tragedy is that revolutionary propaganda deliberately confuses the two. Karl Popper understood something that revolutionaries never did. Human beings are fallible. Governments make mistakes. Institutions make mistakes. Leaders make mistakes. But because we are capable of error, we are also capable of correction. That is the genius of democracy. Not perfection, correction. Not certainty, accountability. Not revolution, reform. In an open society, criticism is not a threat. It is a necessity. The protester is not the enemy of democracy. The protester is one of democracy's safeguards. The journalist exposing corruption. The student questioning authority. The worker demanding fairness. The citizen speaking truth to power. These are not enemies of the state. They are proof that freedom is alive. Revolutionary ideology teaches a very different lesson. It teaches that change comes from coercion, that justice comes from violence, that power grows from the barrel of a gun. But history tells a different story. The greatest democratic victories of our time were not won in ambushes. They were won by citizens, by voters, by reformers, by journalists, by teachers, by ordinary people who refused to surrender either their conscience or their freedom. A bullet can silence a person, but it cannot correct an idea. A rifle can seize territory, but it cannot create legitimacy. Only free citizens can do that. That is why the true activist does not seek to destroy democracy. The true activist seeks to improve it. The true activist does not demand obedience. The true activist demands accountability. The true activist does not worship certainty. The true activist welcomes criticism. And the true activist does not carry an M16. The true activist carries something far more powerful: evidence, truth, conscience, and the courage to stand in public and say, "This can be better." That is Poporian activism. Not the politics of fear, not the politics of violence, but the politics of violence, but the politics of freedom. Because in the end, the most powerful force for change is not the rifle, it is the free human mind. Now for the wrap. For more than 50 years, the Communist Party of the Philippines promised a future that was supposedly inevitable. The revolution would expand, the guerrilla fronts would multiply, the countryside would encircle the cities, the people would rise. Victory was not merely possible, it was portrayed as history's destiny. But Chapter 18 asks a brutal Poporian question: what does the map say? Not the slogans, not the speeches, not the manifestos, the map. Because geography has a way of exposing lies. And the geography of the Philippines today tells a story that revolutionary doctrine cannot explain away. For decades, the CPP claimed to be advancing, yet across the country, the opposite occurred. Former guerrilla strongholds began disappearing. Insurgency-affected communities returned to normal life. Thousands of former rebels surrendered, returned to their families, and chose civilian life over perpetual struggle. The most devastating evidence is geographic. Entire regions once regarded as major revolutionary territories have been declared under stable internal peace and security, or SIPs. Provinces that once hosted active guerrilla fronts now focus on roads, schools, livelihood, tourism, and investment. Barangays once described as revolutionary mass bases are now connected by farm-to-market roads, electrification projects, telecommunications networks, health centers, and government services. This matters because Maoist strategy depends on territory. It depends on influence. It depends on communities serving as political, logistical, and recruitment bases. When those territories disappear, the revolutionary architecture collapses. The map becomes a report card, and the report card is devastating. The revolution promised expansion. The map shows contraction. The revolution promised growth. The map shows retreat. The revolution promised inevitability. The map shows abandonment. The revolution promised history. The people chose something else. Karl Popper taught that when evidence contradicts a theory, the theory must change. But what happens when a movement refuses to change? Reality becomes its executioner. And reality has been merciless. The chapter documents not merely military setbacks, but something far more significant: the rise of peaceful alternatives, amnesty, reintegration, development, governance, community empowerment, the National Action Plan for Unity, Peace and Development, the transformation of former conflict areas into functioning communities with tangible opportunities. The Philippine experience reveals a profound truth. Roads defeat rifles. Livelihood defeats dogma. Opportunity defeats insurgency. A farmer with irrigation does not attend revolutionary education sessions. A student with a scholarship does not need a guerrilla camp to find purpose. A parent whose children can finally attend school does not dream of permanent war. The most dangerous weapon against revolution was never artillery. It was a future worth staying for. That is why Chapter 18 calls this phenomenon the geographic death of Utopia. Not because an army was merely defeated, but because a prophecy was falsified. Because the people quietly voted with their feet, with their choices, with their livelihoods, with their communities, and with their future. The revolution said history belonged to it. The map says otherwise. The map records the most devastating verdict of all. The Filipino people walked past the revolution, and they did not look back.